Hello and welcome to Decision NYC with Ben Max. I'm Ben Max, your host and the executive editor of Gotham Gazette. The 2021 New York City election cycle is well underway, and it's poised to be the most significant municipal election in decades. All of city government is on the ballot, and because so few incumbents are eligible to run for their current seats due to term limits, New Yorkers are electing many new office holders and the next roster of leadership for our city. There will be a new mayor of New York City elected here in 2021, as well as a new city controller, several new borough presidents, and many new city council members. And that's not all that's on the ballot. A number of incumbents are eligible for and seeking re-election, including the city's public advocate. And there's a very crowded and competitive race for Manhattan District Attorney and more. Party primaries are set for June, and the general election in the fall will culminate on November 2nd. This is the first full set of municipal elections that will feature both early voting and the new ranked choice voting system. Ranked choice voting applies only to party primaries and special elections, and we'll have a separate show just on ranked choice voting. This city election cycle would be of enormous importance under more usual circumstances, but it's unfolding at a time of great crisis for our city, raising the stakes of the decisions that you, the voter, will make. This next wave of city leadership will quite clearly make or break the city's recovery from the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic and its many impacts on health, family, jobs, education, housing, and much, much more. There were also several crises facing New York City even before the pandemic struck, and several of those have only worsened. So it's an important time of choosing here in New York City, and we're pleased to bring you this series of interviews with candidates for citywide offices, mayor, controller, public advocate, as well as interviews with candidates for other offices like borough president and district attorney. And there will be debates, including for city council seats. But these one-on-one conversations will help you to get to know the candidates better, learn about their backgrounds, their platforms, their vision for the future of the city and the office they are seeking. Today, we're focused on the position of New York City Comptroller. The Comptroller is a citywide elected position and considered the city's independently elected chief fiscal officer and budget watchdog. The Comptroller evaluates many city contracts with outside entities, audits city agencies to find waste and inefficiency, and makes recommendations and proposals to improve city government, as well as other services and entities impacting New Yorkers. And quite crucially, the Comptroller is fiduciary to the city's 5 public pension funds that total approximately $240 billion in assets for the city's retirees or public employees who will become those retirees. So to discuss his campaign for New York City Comptroller, joining me now by Zoom is Alex Pan, who's running in the Democratic primary for Comptroller of New York City. Alex, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you for having me.
So before we get to your controller campaign, a little bit about your background, who you are, where you come from, a little bit about you before jumping into this race.
Oh, yeah. Hi, I'm Alex. I'm an 18-year-old college student. I was born and raised a Queens boy from Ozone Park. And I am quite literally a recent voter. I think that I'm in the running because our city needs good leadership, good government, and people that don't cave to special interests. And what better way to do that than with somebody who has A, never held public office, but B, is not going to be swayed by lobbyists and the big corporations. So that's a little bit about me, and I'd love to delve into more with you.
All right, so you grew up in Queens and you're in college now. Tell us a little bit about that.
It's been an interesting ride, definitely. I remember high school transitioning remotely, having to get accustomed to a more Zoom-focused world, and transitioning to college with that same focus, and now campaigning with that same focus. It's really it's challenging having to campaign without as much in-person focus. Definitely with petitioning and all of that, we're trying to make sure that our volunteers stay safe. And we've been relying heavily on our partnerships and omnibus petitions to get us to where we are today.
Before we dig a little bit more into your campaign, what has that experience and what you've seen for yourself, for peers, about the shift to remote learning or hybrid learning, so much shifting online during the pandemic? how do you assess what that's meant to this sort of generation of young people who have had to face these challenges and trying to, continue with their learning? There's a unique set of challenges, obviously, at different ages, different interests, people who have been in some school or no school, people like yourself who've had to transition from one school to another. But how are you thinking about the challenges that the younger generation has faced with the pandemic and education?
I think that one of the big things right now is engagement. You see varying levels of it, whether it's my own experience and those of students around the city, varying on your school, the technology you have available at home, the fact that some students just don't have stable Wi-Fi and laptops or tablets or the technology they need to go to school. And not only that, but also the varying levels of engagement that their school provides. So I think that while there were programs that were offered when the pandemic first started to try and offset that, I think that that was done quite well. And we should continue looking at how we could straighten things like that, because I think that Zoom is not going to go away. And we should be looking at ways to better incorporate technology into our classrooms, especially with the DOE's current initiatives. I've seen them in action. I'm a pretty big fan. Um, there's that. But also, I think that given the fact that over a virtual world, students may experience a lack of physical connection, and that might negatively impact their mental health. So I think that we need to further engage and look at better ways to engage with student mental health with additional counselors and just added support in that realm.
Let's talk a little bit about a decision to run for office. You're just starting your college career. So talk a little bit about the decision to run for office at all, and then much less a citywide position with the responsibility of controller. How'd you make both those decisions?
I think that I love my city, I love my home, I love my family, and every single time I hop on the train, I just look out, and I just fall in love with what I see. And the fact that I'm just here thinking that if I had a chance to sit in that office, what would I do? Um, my answer immediately doesn't go to something hyper specific. It goes to I want to make sure that not only my own family, but the families of other people, all of their loved ones are living happy, housed, safe lives. And to make sure that that lifestyle is ensured for generations to come, whether it's my generation, the generation after us. And the fact that our decisions now are so crucial because of the pandemic, that it could be just shaping our city for decades. And I wanted to throw my hat into the ring because by doing that, by engaging, by doing more than just saying, I want to go onto Instagram and share something, I want to go volunteer with a campaign. You're saying, I want to put my own story out there and have people give it a look.
And so, what are the key pillars of your controller platform? What would you do as city's controller if elected?
So I had three main pillars. One being we have to slash the city's debt. We have so much of it, and just flat out, we need to cut it. This way, it's not burdening us down the road. We are not paying service to it every single year, and we could then reinvest that money into other priorities. Two, reform the police with our social upheaval, racial discussions on systemic racism, on police brutality, on just everything that's happened throughout the past year. I think it's really important to look at how to make sure that the police are treating people more equitably. We are reducing violence across the city while also making sure that we are addressing the fact that there is racial profiling, implicit bias, all of these things, because we can't get rid of the police, but we can try to change them and play with their budgets and make sure that we are making investments in the places that need investing and cuts in places that need cutting. And then finally, desegregating our schools. When we look at the specialized high schools admissions test, we look at screened schools and unscreened schools, we look at the gap in funding the student outcomes, the racial makeups, it's pretty clear. I definitely back what Teens Take Charge and a lot of other groups have been saying around this topic for years at this point. Our schools are segregated, and we need to make sure that there is equitable education available to everybody in our city.
All right, so let's take those each a little further. Slashing the city's debt. What exactly is the problem with the city's debt? And most of the debt is incurred for funding capital projects, infrastructure around the city. What's the problem with that?
I think that we do need to invest in infrastructure. However, the process of approving contracts and sometimes when they drag out, it incurs more cost to the city. Controller Stringer, he's done a great job of trying to cut down that time, and that makes sure that we are not spending as much in that waiting period between approval, and that would significantly cut down some costs. That's one thing, and I would continue to do that and look for further ways to make sure that that process is more efficient for both us and the companies that we contract with. And then two, we also need to just re-examine how we are rewarding these contracts and making sure that if we can make some cuts, it's pretty obvious sometimes that government contracts are lucrative. It's a good business to be in. And if we can make some tiny adjustments here and there with our massive incurred bonds in, of course, this isn't exactly under the city controller's purview, but the water and sewage treatment management services, and of course the MTA is not under the city controller's purview. But what we can do is we have a bully pulpit, and we have the ability to say we want to work with the state controller and work towards cutting down debt on capital construction. That's our big way of going about that.
Police budgeting, you said, I think play with the budget. What do you have in mind for the NYPD budget? What do you think really needs to be looked closer at, cut, expanded, if there's anything expanded?
So after we were looking at the NYPD budget and just other reports produced by the controller, we saw that for things like, let's say, the body cam program, we want to continue investing and expanding in that. I think that accountability is important, and we need to make that investment. However, if there are hiring freezes across city agencies and there is the NYPD, we should be looking at temporary hiring freezes and letting officers attrit to cut down the costs a little bit, and then reinvest that money into mental health professionals and alternative responses to using the police. And by shifting that, there could be major benefits. There are also things like, let's say, the school safety agents under the NYPD at the moment. We would be looking at it and we would say, well, we should transfer it to the Department of Education and take that away from the police department, because in all fairness, that would give more autonomy to our schools, and that will relieve some of the burden of the NYPD and the massive bureaucracy that it is.
That's not, well, the Department of Education is a much bigger bureaucracy than the NYPD, but that's not really saving any money. But the idea of possibly letting officers attrit and not replacing them certainly would. So the NYPD headcount of uniformed officers is somewhere around 35,000, 36,000. Do you have a sense of what you think that headcount of uniformed officers should be?
I will be very blunt with you right now, Ben. I don't have an answer to that. And I think that what we need to look at is crime is rising in the city. There are more shootings than ever, and we need to make sure that our officers can respond to that. But at the same time, for nonviolent crime and situations that don't require a forceful response, then we can look at alternative ways. And I think that's the main thing. After we look at the numbers and we find that we can make a responsible decision in what number we should be at.
Just to be clear, in the last year or so, shootings and murders have been on the rise, but several other categories of crime have actually been down, and shootings are not higher than ever. They're higher than the last few years, but don't have to go back too far to find when they were higher even than 2020. So on the third category of desegregating the city's schools, What do you think the role of the controller is on that, and how would you use the tools of the office to push that agenda forward?
So we have the specialized high schools admissions test. I would propose looking at our spending in building that test and administering that test, um, because I do think that the availability of resources to different students that really causes the chasm of who's accepted into a school or not. If you're from one neighborhood that is lower income and their schools are not providing anything, and the parents are not able to afford tutoring and preparation for this exam, then obviously the outcome is probably not going to be as good as the other families that can't afford it. And that creates that gap. So I think what we really have to do is look for a more holistic approach to admissions. And just generally, this is a step in the right direction.
That's 8 schools, though. What about, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about desegregating the larger school system, which some people say could actually be one of the key steps to desegregating the specialized high schools. You said you're in favor of broader desegregation measures,
Mhm.
as in what Teens Take Charge have called for.
Yes. So looking at screened, unscreened schools, I think that so my high school was I believe educational optional, something along those lines. And basically, um, what it did was we looked at scores to make sure that we had a broad spectrum of achievement. So we had students who had, I believe, a high amount of, well, a pretty solid 3 or 4 in their state math test scores or their English test scores. And you have students that are more in the middle and you have more in the end. And the goal is to provide mobility. You take students from all of these pools, and we are not just saying we want you to either take a test to come into our school, because there are some schools that do that. Others just look at, they just want the top 4.0 GPA students. And what we're going to do is we will say we want the entire spectrum so that you have an opportunity to utilize the resources of this school and rise in mobility.
The city controller primary is featuring a number of elected officials, some folks who are not elected officials but have background in finance and public finance. There's a debate happening among those candidates about qualifications. What would you say to voters about your qualifications to run this office, both as a manager, just generally? There's hundreds of employees at the city controller's office, accountants, analysts, finance experts. Broadly speaking, the ability to come in and manage the office, but then also on the technical side, the office obviously has to deal with very complicated financial matters. We haven't talked about the pension funds yet. We will in a minute. But on the two sides of the coin there, in terms of qualifications, both generally on management, but also on the sort of more technical sides, auditing city agencies, analyzing the budget, the pension investments. What do you say to voters who might be concerned about a lack of qualifications there?
The controller's position is inherently a political role. Um, what qualifies me is the fact that you have a sprawling department with a bunch of highly qualified individuals that hold degrees, that have years of experience in whether it's investing and management and auditing. And what I would be doing is I would be setting the vision and setting the policy, and just sort of being I like using the analogy of an aircraft carrier. Meetings start forming and you are the launch pad. And what really happens is you have to learn how to delegate and have your managers and your lieutenants and people work with you. And that's what I would be doing. I'd be lying to you to say that I'm the most qualified investor, or I'd be good at portfolio management specifically, because I simply don't have that experience. However, we are paying out of the taxpayers' dollars people to do this for a reason. And what they're supposed to do is present options, to present ideas and to pitch them. And I will be making a decision from there.
And what do you base those decisions on if you don't have a lot of the experience in government, the experience in finance? How do you make those decisions?
First, I keep advisors with me. They'll offer their 2 cents, but then I'm going to be following just sort of my brain and thinking, well, what is best for the city in the long run, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? What is the impact of our decisions right now, immediately, and the risk that we might be taking, whether it's something policy wise or something with the pension funds? We need to make sure that we are being bold enough to ensure that we can ensure that your investment is being returned, that we are growing the pension fund at, I believe, the 7% rate. And however, making sure that we are not gambling away the pensions of our hardworking city workers. So it's a really fine line, but at the end of the day, you want to elect somebody who has your best interest in mind, who can empathize and understand where you came from, and can utilize that to make decisions that hopefully you would make yourself if you were in my shoes.
So let's talk about the pension funds. How would you approach your responsibilities there? As you've said, the office is full of experts, advisors. The pension funds have their own boards for the different unions that are represented, but you still have a responsibility to help manage it all, a fiduciary responsibility. How would you approach that? Would you do anything significantly different than what occurs right now and what the current controller, Scott Stringer, who you mentioned earlier, has been doing? How would you approach that significant aspect of the job?
hmm I'm a big fan of how the current controller manages the pension funds, and I remember reading through his recommendations and the results of his auditing reports. And first of all, I would just like to say that I am here to not only to serve the public, but also listen to the boards of these pension funds. I'll be taking their considerations and thoughts to mind. And the whole point is that while I'm supposed to be making a decision, I'm also supposed to be listening to you. But that aside, I think that we should be utilizing our pension funds and flexible funding to make sure that we are investing in affordable housing, that we're investing in programs and just initiatives that can bring us significant returns and grow that money out, while also making sure that we are slowly divesting from fossil fuels and investing more into sustainable energy. And I think that those more policy focused directions sometimes may come into a potential clash with growing the pensions, because let's be really honest right now, investing into Chevron or another oil company, it's hard because there is a significant amount that's currently in there right now. And I'm hoping over the years, as sustainable energy becomes even more prominent and just easier to invest in, where currently right now, I remember reading a report from the current controller about divesting from fossil fuels. And we're moving in that direction within a couple of years so that we are fully divested. I believe within 2 to 4 years. You could correct me on that one, but I do remember vague mention of that.
So it sounds like you are interested in continuing this sort of activist investor mindset, but you want to do it with caution.
hmm Definitely. I think that a big thing is that we have so much money to the point where we can just sort of sway the market in a significant way. We're a big weight, and we need to start acting like it.
That actually raises an interesting question, because there's an argument that by divesting you basically give up your bargaining chips. You can't really push the entities that you're looking to impact if you don't have holdings, and so that's been one of the sort of questions and criticism of the divestment approach, is that you may not be able to really impact the direction that some of these companies are taking if you fully release your holdings.
I think in the contrary, the fact is that yes, we could influence these companies because we have holdings in them, but at the same time, our country is becoming more green. At some point, fossil fuels are going to be a thing of the past, because the world is starting to understand that sustainable energy is the future. And by us getting A, on the train early, but B, sending that message to whether it's the Biden administration, to these companies, to the market, that we need to start moving fast to make sure that if we don't do this, New York City is going to be swimming in water. Erecting barricades on the waterfront isn't going to do anything. If you realize that we're all going to be swamped in toast at some point.
So we're in our last few minutes here. I want to make sure we get to a couple other things. One of the most important parts of the job of city controller is the audit power and responsibility to audit city agencies. How would you approach that work? Is there anything you've seen from the current or previous controllers that would either be a model or something you would look to not do? And how would you try to make sure that that responsibility is both carried out well and has maximum impact on city government efficiency and productivity?
I think that a big thing for me in terms of auditing is making sure that our audits are easier, more easily accessible to the public. I think that I like what I've seen in current audits by our current controller and just occasional audits I've read in the past. But I think that sometimes they're sort of harder to access. And if we are able to make sure that the average Joe can just look at the easy statistics and say, wow, this is what's going on here. I'm also a big fan of consolidating it so that there are auditing summaries and things of that nature that are also sort of sometimes tucked away. And we would make those a lot more easy to be digested by the public because public knowledge of our auditing is really important. Also, just sort of sometimes the more activist mindset to auditing. While we want to be activist in heart, we also need to be fair. I think that in things like, let's say, charter schools and their admissions practices or other areas where we could be auditing, we need to look at them and say, hey, we are coming in here once every 4 years or once every 2 years, and we are looking at your books, we are looking at the data, and we will be providing you recommendations and suggestions and actions afterwards.
And lastly, it doesn't seem like you've really raised money for this campaign. Are you going to be able to do that in any significant way to really get your message out? Or how do you feel just in our last minute here, like you'll be able to compete in this primary as we approach the June vote?
I think that campaigns are about the policies, about the candidate themselves, and what this campaign really is. I'm really thankful for all of our volunteers so far. And I do recognize that at the moment, it's a pretty bare bones campaign. So I would really appreciate more donors. But I think in the coming days, as petitions are coming in and we solidly get on the ballot, I think a lot of people are still sort of in the mind, wow, an 18-year-old is running for office. Can he actually make it? And when they see, wow, there's actually support behind his platform and his policies, they will be a lot more willing to give it another look, to donate and support and help us win this election.
All right, well, we're going to leave it there. Alex Pan is a Democratic candidate for New York City Comptroller. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me, Ben.
And thank you for watching Decision NYC with Ben Max. Key decisions are coming up for New York City voters in the June primaries and the fall general election. There's a lot on the line for all of us in the future of New York City. I hope this conversation and others are helpful to you as you sort through your many choices to make informed decisions when it's time to vote. Until next time, I'm Ben Max. See you soon.